You girls get lonely out here at night? Bet you'd be sweeter if you smiled for us." Hawk sneered, his fingers trailing just inches from Ellie's face. Betty stepped forward, voice trembling. "Leave her alone." Tank laughed, tossing a beer can over the counter. "What's Grandma gonna do, cry?" From the corner booth, Calvin Mercer had seen enough. He stood slowly, paid for his coffee without a word, and walked out into the night. Inside, tension thickened. Ellie's knuckles tightened around the receipt printer as Hawk leaned in, his voice low and taunting. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, helpless. Then, the soft chime above the door. Heads turned. Calvin Mercer was back. Two men stepped in. Calvin Mercer looked Hawk straight in the eye. "That's enough," he said. And just like that, the entire room shifted. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the asphalt still gleamed under the flickering lights of the Rock Ridge truck stop, just off Highway 40, somewhere in the vast, dark belly of Texas. A neon sign buzzed faintly above the convenience store entrance, casting an unsteady red glow on the puddles below. Inside, the hum of refrigerators and the soft gurgle of the coffee machine provided the only soundtrack. It was the kind of place truckers knew not by name, but by feeling. Calvin Mercer sat at a corner booth with a chipped ceramic mug cradled between both hands. 67, hair gone silver, beard neatly trimmed. His weathered denim jacket looked like it had stories to tell, but Calvin didn't offer many, a man of few words and fewer explanations. He didn't need to say much anyway. His eyes said plenty. They scanned, measured, filed away every detail. The habit of a former Marine Corps sergeant wasn't something you could just turn off, even after 4 decades. To most who passed by, Calvin was just another tired trucker running the late shift. But those who paid attention, really paid attention, could feel something else. It was in the way he sat, never fully relaxed, in the way his coffee stayed untouched a little too long, because his mind was always on the exits, the angles, the people in the room. After the military, Calvin had taken to the road not out of wanderlust, but necessity. He'd buried a few comrades, watched a marriage fall apart, and owed more than he could pay. So he took what he had left, a commercial license and a strong back, and kept going. He'd been on the road ever since, calling no place home except the cab of his red Peterbilt. To Calvin, silence was comfort, distance was safety, but he had rules, etched into his soul like old dog tags. Protect the weak. Speak only when it matters. Never start a fight, but always finish it. The Rock Ridge stop was one of those familiar places he passed through every few weeks. It wasn't glamorous, but it had two things Calvin valued more than comfort: honesty and routine. Behind the counter stood Ellie, just 24, but already bearing the weight of someone twice her age. Her uniform didn't fit quite right. It was a size too big, rolled sleeves, tired collar, but she wore it with resolve. A single mother to a 4-year-old boy back in town, Ellie worked the night shift to make ends meet and still get home in time to walk her son to preschool. Her smile when she used it was soft but guarded, like someone who had learned not to trust it too easily. Tonight, though, she wasn't smiling. She stood near the receipt printer, tapping buttons with one hand while her eyes darted to the window every time a loud engine passed. Beside her, Margie moved with the steadiness of a woman who had done this job for over 20 years. At 60, she knew every regular by name, every shortcut in the inventory system, and the exact timing of the coffee machine's sputter before it finished brewing. To younger employees, Margie was a mentor. To customers, she was a silent guardian, someone who would offer you warmth in a styrofoam cup and call the sheriff if she had to. Her husband had been a welder, lost him 8 winters ago. Since then, she poured her strength into work and the quiet protection of those around her. The night so far had been calm. A couple drivers, a lone RV family passing through. Calvin had said his usual few words. Black, no sugar. Ellie had nodded. Margie had offered a polite, storm might roll in later. But the air tonight held something different. Not the electric crackle of thunder, but a different kind of pressure. The kind soldiers and survivors could feel before anything actually happened. A strange stillness, like the pause between a match being struck and the flare that followed. Calvin noticed it first. Ellie felt it next. And Margie, ever intuitive, already had her eyes on the door. Something was coming, and the quiet wasn't going to last. The moment came not with warning, but with noise. The distant roar of engines tore through the stillness like a blade through canvas. Ellie looked up from the receipt printer. Margie's hand froze over the napkin dispenser. Even Calvin's gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the front window. 4 motorcycles screamed into the lot, their headlights casting angry halos across the wet asphalt. They parked in a tight, cocky line, chrome glinting under the neon light, the rumble of engines lingering like a threat. The lead rider dismounted with a theatrical swing of the leg, black boots hitting pavement hard. He yanked off his helmet and shook out a mane of greasy dark hair. Hawk. That's what the patch on his leather vest said, though he didn't need it. You could feel the arrogance in every step he took, like he believed the world owed him something, and he had come to collect. His arms were inked up to the shoulders, a faded Confederate flag wrapped around one bicep, and a jagged scar cut down the right side of his neck like a trophy. Behind him came his crew. Tank, short and barrel-chested, had a laugh like a shotgun blast and a mouth that never stopped moving. Razor, lean and wiry, with a twitch in his left eye that never quite stilled. And Viper, the youngest, still trying too hard to impress, chewing gum like it was a statement of dominance. The bell above the door chimed once, then again, as they shoved into the store like a gust of foul wind. The space immediately felt smaller. "Well, would you look at this little gem," Hawk said, smirking as he scanned the room. "Ain't this a cozy little dump?" Ellie straightened, forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you gentlemen with anything?" Hawk ignored the question, stepping right up to the counter. His eyes scanned her face, slow and deliberate, like he was measuring the value of something. "You girls get lonely out here at night?" he asked, voice dripping with mock concern. "Bet you'd be sweeter if you smiled for us." His fingers hovered dangerously close to her cheek. Ellie flinched, stepping back. "Leave her alone," Margie said sharply, stepping in. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Hawk turned slowly to look at her. Tank laughed and chucked a half-crushed beer can over the counter. "What's Grandma gonna do? Call the sheriff?" Calvin didn't move. He sat in the corner booth, one hand still wrapped around his coffee cup, his other resting on the table. His eyes followed every motion. Hawk's shifting weight, Razor's fingers grazing the candy rack, Viper's subtle attempt to move behind the counter. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating. "Hey there, sweetheart," Viper said to Ellie, leaning in from the side. "You ever ride on a real Harley? I could show you what it feels like." Ellie's grip tightened around the receipt printer. Her jaw clenched. "No thanks," she muttered. Hawk leaned in again, closer than before. "Come on now. You deserve better than this place. Bet you'd look good with some wind in your hair." Margie stepped forward. "That's enough." Hawk turned to her, amused. "You're brave. I like that." "Then show some respect," she snapped. Razor walked over to the radio behind the register and twisted the dial hard until a heavy rock station blared from the speakers. The sound was jarring, too loud for the small space. Margie covered her ears. "This place needed some life," Tank said, kicking over a mop bucket for emphasis. Ellie tried to turn the volume down, but Hawk stepped in her path again. "No, no. Leave it, sweetheart. The party's just getting started." Then he leaned closer, so close she could smell the beer on his breath. "Maybe you could join us." She backed up until she hit the counter. From the booth, Calvin's eyes narrowed just slightly. He hadn't moved, but inside something had shifted. It wasn't fear. It was something older, something colder. The kind of silence that always came before a reckoning. And still he waited. Because timing, Calvin Mercer had learned long ago, was everything. The music was too loud now. Distorted guitars screaming through speakers meant for soft country radio. Razor had twisted the knob all the way to max, laughing like a hyena. Bass lines thumped against the thin walls. Somewhere in the back, a rack of potato chips toppled. Margie winced. "Turn that down," she called out over the noise, voice firm but cracking just a bit. Hawk turned from the counter. "What's that, Grandma?" "I said turn it down." He smiled and walked toward the counter, each bootfall landing a little heavier than the last. His hands shot out, quick and sudden, and yanked the phone off its cradle behind the counter. "No need for backup," he said. "We're just getting acquainted." Then he dropped the receiver behind the register, far out of reach. Margie stiffened. That's enough, Hawk. He leaned closer. You know my name. That's sweet. He cocked his head toward Ellie. You girls got fans out here? Boyfriends, husbands, cops on speed dial? Ellie didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, jaw clenched, hands white-knuckled around the receipt printer like it might protect her. And from the booth in the corner, Calvin Mercer stood up, quietly, slowly, deliberately. He reached into his pocket, took out a few crumpled bills, and placed them neatly on the counter. For the coffee, he said softly. Then he turned toward the door. Tank snorted. Guess the old man's had enough. Ruck. Too bad, Hawk called out, taking a few steps toward him. I was starting to enjoy the company. Calvin said nothing. His boots clicked lightly on the tile floor as he approached the door. His hand reached out for the handle, steady, unhurried. Then it came, thwop. An empty beer can hit him squarely between the shoulder blades. It clattered to the floor with a hollow rattle. The entire room seemed to pause. Hawk's voice followed, mocking. You forgot your trash, old man. Calvin didn't turn, not at first. He stood there for a long moment, hands still resting on the doorframe, back straight. The only sound now was the whine of the music speaker, distorting under too much volume. Then slowly he turned and looked at Hawk, their eyes locked. Calvin's expression was unreadable. No anger, no fear, just presence. What's wrong? Hawk said, stepping forward, puffed up. Not gonna say goodbye? Still nothing. Razor moved to Calvin's left, Tank to his right. Viper leaned against the chip rack, grinning like a fool. You don't talk much, huh? Hawk jeered. That's rude. You should say sorry for walking out like that. Real bad manners. Calvin took a breath, calm and controlled. I was just leaving, he said. Not yet, you're not. Hawk placed one hand against Calvin's chest and gave a slight push. Not hard, but enough to make a point. Say you're sorry. Calvin looked down at the hand, then back at Hawk. His jaw tightened for just a second. Ellie's eyes widened. Margie took a half step forward, but no one spoke. Then came the moment no one expected. Calvin nodded just once and said quietly but clearly, sorry. There was no sarcasm, no pleading, just a word, given with the kind of weight only a man like him could carry. The room froze. Hawk blinked, confused. He hadn't expected that. There we go, Hawk said, clapping once. See? Easy, wasn't it? Calvin turned again and opened the door. Cold night air rushed into the store, washing over everyone like a breath of fresh judgment. Hawk laughed behind him, triumphant. Tank shouted something crude. Razor whooped. Ellie just stood frozen, unsure what to feel. No one knew what Calvin was thinking as he disappeared into the darkness, but they should have known better. Outside, Calvin walked slowly back toward his Peterbilt, parked just along the edge of the lot. The diesel engine ticked softly in the cold, settling after hours of idle. He paused by the cab, resting one hand on the chrome handle. He didn't climb in, not yet. Instead, he moved around to the passenger side, reached beneath the running board, pulled something out, a long black sheath, the glint of steel inside, his M9 bayonet, 30 years on the road, 30 years avoiding trouble. But tonight wasn't about him. He looked back toward the truck stop. Inside, the silhouettes of the bikers moved in wild, careless gestures. Ellie and Margie were still behind the counter, alone. And Calvin Mercer wasn't built to walk away from that. Not then, not now. The night air bit colder now. Calvin Mercer stood in the shadows beside his truck, fingers closing around the familiar grip of his old Marine-issued M9 bayonet. The blade still held a faint glint beneath the lot's flickering lights. He hadn't drawn it in years, not for anything more serious than peeling wire insulation or cutting tarp straps. But tonight wasn't about tools. Tonight was about principle. Across the lot, the four Harleys sat in a proud, arrogant row, gleaming chrome, loud paint, low-slung frames meant to impress. Calvin approached them slowly, silently, the soles of his boots barely making a sound on the damp asphalt. The bikers inside wouldn't hear anything, not over the blaring music and their own hollow laughter. One by one, he moved. The blades sliced into each thick sidewall with practiced ease, not deep gashes, just enough to let the air hiss out in a long, quiet exhale, like letting the soul slip out of a monster without waking it. Psst. One tire, two, three, four. Each bike settled lower to the ground, sagging on its frame like a drunk man folding at the knees. When it was done, Calvin backed into the shadows near the side wall of the truck stop and pulled out an old beat-up flip phone. Not a smartphone, just an old prepaid clamshell with cracked buttons and a sticker of the Marine Corps emblem on the back. He scrolled past the list of saved contacts and opened the group chat labeled Brothers of the Road. It was a quiet network, mostly ex-military drivers who'd kept in touch over the years. Men who'd served in different branches, different wars, but had the same code stitched into their bones. Calvin didn't call on them often, but when he did, they answered. He typed quickly, Rock Ridge stop, 4 bikers harassing staff. Need backup, no police. Just presence, then hit send. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering past the pumps. Then, bzzzt. A reply blinked on screen in under 30 seconds. Big Walt. On my way, brother. 10 minutes out. Calvin allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Big Walt. Real name, Walter Higgins. 6'7", 300 pounds of muscle and steel nerves. A former convoy gunner turned livestock hauler. Calvin hadn't seen him in over a year, but he still remembered the man's handshake, like gripping a cinder block wrapped in leather. A moment later, more messages rolled in. Tommy R. Turning back, 5 minutes. Red Mike. Already nearby, circling in. Duke. Say the word, I roll heavy. Calvin closed the phone and slipped it back into his jacket. It was done now. Set in motion. He leaned back against the side of his truck, arms folded, the bayonet tucked once again beneath the seat. The wind tugged at his collar. He lit a cigarette, his one vice, and watched the road. Oh. And just as promised, less than 10 minutes later, the night began to shift. It started with headlights. First one, then another, then 3 more. Beams of light sweeping across the lot like searchlights at sea. The first truck to roll in was a matte black Kenworth T80, its grille scarred from years of hauling rebar and timber. Behind it came a sky blue Freightliner Cascadia, humming like a sleeping beast. A red Volvo VNL rolled in next, flanked by 2 long-nosed Western Stars. Their engines rumbled low, controlled power, no showboating. The rigs didn't park in a line. They circled, strategically, like old cavalry wagons drawing into formation. One parked near the entrance. 2 more blocked the rear exit. Another idled across from the gas pumps. The final 2 pulled up nose to nose near the diesel island, creating a steel curtain. And then came Big Walt, driving a white Peterbilt 389 with blue racing stripes and a battered Marine Corps flag painted on the back. He parked broadside across the lot entrance and stepped down. No rush, no theater, just presence. Walt spotted Calvin immediately. He gave a slight nod, then crossed the pavement like a man heading to the pulpit. He wore a denim vest over a flannel shirt, thick forearms exposed, tattoos faded but still sharp. His beard was like a steel brush, his eyes calm as still water. "What's the situation?" he asked. Calvin motioned toward the glowing windows of the truck stop. Inside, the silhouettes of Hawk and his crew moved around the counter, pacing like wolves sniffing a cage. 4 inside, Calvin said. Ellie and Margie are alone. Walt followed his gaze. When he noticed the slashed tires, he smirked. You always were surgical. Calvin didn't smile. Didn't want blood, just immobility. More rigs were still idling, drivers stepping out. Some leaned against their bumpers. Others just stood near their doors. They didn't need directions, didn't need weapons. They just stood there. Men of the road, men who'd seen things, men who didn't let cowards take over the night. Inside, the laughter was starting to fade, and soon it would stop entirely. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time, it wasn't followed by laughter or stomping boots. It was the kind of chime that made the room fall still. Inside, Hawk stood near the front counter, arms spread across its surface like he owned the place. Tank was digging through the cooler for another beer, Razor messing with the music, and Viper tossing snack bags onto the floor just to hear them crinkle. Ellie had shrunk into the corner of the register area. Margie stood stiff beside her, arms crossed tight, her lips pressed into a line. The noise had dulled, but the threat lingered like smoke. And then they stepped in. Calvin Mercer and Big Walt. No shouting, no posturing, just presence. Walt filled the doorway, massive, silent, a silhouette of resolve. His shadow stretched across the linoleum like a warning. Beside him, Calvin moved calmly, like gravity obeyed him differently than everyone else. The music was still playing, but suddenly it didn't feel loud. It felt ridiculous. Hawk turned, smirk already forming, until he saw who it was. His expression faltered. "Back so soon, Grandpa?" he sneered, trying to regain footing. "Forgot your manners again?" Calvin said nothing at first. He stepped forward, slow and measured. His eyes met Hawk's and held them there. Behind him, Walt crossed his arms. No words, just quiet weight. Two more truckers appeared at the window outside, their figures leaning casually against their rigs, eyes locked on the store. The whole place felt smaller now. "You okay, sweetheart?" Calvin asked, glancing toward Ellie. She gave a hesitant nod. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but she couldn't get it out. Margie's eyes never left Calvin's. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Hawk barked a laugh. "So what, you brought backup? A little army of old-timers gonna teach us a lesson?" Walt stepped forward, voice low and calm. "You boys might want to head on out." There was no threat in his tone, no bravado, just advice. But the weight of it dropped heavy on the floor. Razor shifted uncomfortably near the drink machine. Viper looked toward the window and noticed the growing number of truckers outside. Tank stood a little too still, holding a bottle of beer he no longer had the appetite for. Hawk looked around, jaw tightening. He tried to keep the smirk. It was slipping. Calvin finally spoke again. "It's time you left." Hawk stepped forward, but not as confidently as before. "We're paying customers." "No one said otherwise," Calvin replied. "You're free to leave as soon as you're ready." "You think you can run us off with a stare?" Hawk asked. Walt leaned against the wall beside the counter. "Son, if we wanted to run you off, you'd already be gone." That landed differently. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of weight, of men who knew exactly what they were capable of and didn't need to prove it. Tank muttered, "Yeah, maybe it's time." Razor gave a half-hearted shrug and stepped back from the cooler. Viper didn't say anything at all. He just moved toward the exit like he wasn't sure when he'd made the decision. Hawk's jaw clenched. "You're all crazy." "No," Calvin said. "We're just tired of bullies thinking nobody will stand up." That broke it. The four bikers walked to the door, single file, not chased, not shoved, just dismissed. The bell chimed again as they left, and outside, they stopped cold. Their bikes. All four Harleys sat awkwardly low on their frames, tires flattened and sad-looking, chrome no longer proud but pitiful. Around the lot, rigs had boxed them in, parked with purpose. There was no clear path out. No engine roar would fix this. "What the hell?" Hawk growled, stepping toward his bike. Tank kicked a tire in frustration. Razor looked around, bewildered. Viper said nothing. Again. Calvin and Walt stood in the doorway behind them. Other truckers stepped forward now, casual but firm. One lit a cigarette, another sipped from a thermos. Not one said a word. It was all understood. "What did you do?" Hawk hissed, eyes narrowing. Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong with your tires? You slashed them." "I didn't see anything," Walt added, arms crossed. "Did you?" The other truckers shook their heads, deadpan. "Nope. Must have been a bad batch. Rubber's cheap these days." There was nothing left for Hawk to say, no pride left to throw around. He looked at the circle of headlights, the silent ring of diesel giants, and realized there would be no fight tonight, only humiliation, the kind that would stick. He didn't speak as he started pushing his Harley across the lot. The others followed, struggling to keep the heavy bikes moving. They passed by Calvin without a word. He didn't gloat, didn't smile, just stood there, like a man who had finished a long day's work, and finally peace was returning. Behind him, Ellie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. And Margie finally allowed herself the tiniest smile, The store once again belonged to the quiet. Under the pale orange haze of the lot's overhead lights, four silhouettes trudged across the cracked pavement, each one pushing a crippled Harley-Davidson in frustrated silence. There was no shouting now, no laughter, no bravado, just the heavy sound of rubber scraping asphalt, chrome clinking, and boots scuffing against gravel. Hawk led the line, eyes fixed forward, jaw locked. Razor walked a few paces behind, dragging his bike like it weighed twice its normal weight. Tank muttered curses under his breath, none of them aimed at anyone in particular. Viper kept his head down, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold night air. They passed the row of trucks slowly, shame thick in the silence. Not a single trucker moved to stop them. Not a word was spoken. No one needed to gloat. That would have cheapened it. The quiet, the humiliating, echoing quiet, was enough. One by one, the bikers disappeared down the road, swallowed by the darkness, engines silent, pride punctured. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled into the wind. It sounded almost like laughter. Back inside the Rock Ridge truck stop, calm had returned. The music had been turned off. The chip bags were cleaned up. The cooler door no longer hung open. Margie stood at the counter, arms crossed, watching the street through the window with quiet satisfaction. Ellie stood beside her, still a little pale but steady. Her fingers had stopped trembling. She had even started breathing normally again. Calvin Mercer stepped up to the counter and laid a $10 bill on top of his old coffee receipt. "For the refill," he said, though everyone knew the refill had never been poured. Ellie blinked, her voice just above a whisper. "Thank you for coming back." Calvin gave her a small nod. "You did well." She opened her mouth to protest, maybe say she hadn't done anything brave, but he held up a hand. "You stood your ground," he said. "That's more than most do." Then he turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he looked back one last time and said quietly, "Don't let anyone make you feel small in your own place. Ever." Ellie's eyes shone, not with tears, but with something steadier, a kind of strength being stitched together in real time. Margie reached out and gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. Outside, the trucks had started their engines again, one by one. Tail lights glowed, diesel rumbled low and familiar. It wasn't a parade, it wasn't a show. It was just the end of another shift for men who had each seen too much to brag about anything. Big Walt gave Calvin a nod as he climbed back into his cab. "If you ever need us again," he said. "I know," Calvin replied, "but let's hope I don't." Walt chuckled and disappeared into his truck. Calvin climbed into his own rig, the red Peterbilt 389 that had carried him through 3 decades in 20 states. He sat there for a moment with the door still open, looking back toward the store. The lights inside glowed warm now. Safe. He shut the door, started the engine, and pulled out onto the road without rush, without fanfare. Just a man heading to the next mile. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the space between intention and action. The moment when something inside you decides, enough. And in a world full of noise, it's often the quiet ones who move with the most purpose. Men like Calvin Mercer don't wear badges anymore. They don't need medals or titles. They just keep watch, one truck stop at a time, standing in the shadows, waiting for the moment they're needed. When justice calls, they don't raise their voices. They simply show up. In a world that seems louder and meaner by the day, maybe we've forgotten the power of quiet strength. Calvin Mercer didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw punches. But he reminded us that courage isn't always about confrontation. It's about timing, restraint, and knowing when to act, and when to wait. In a culture where so much is measured by how loud or flashy someone is, Calvin shows us that dignity and principle still matter. And maybe that's something we need more of today. At every coffee shop, parking lot, or quiet little corner of America, there are people like Ellie, working hard, hoping no one notices them for the wrong reasons. And people like Margie, who've stood the test of time, quietly protecting others, even when it costs them comfort. And maybe, just maybe, there are still Calvins out there too. Men and women who don't wear uniforms anymore, but still carry the code. What would you have done in Calvin's place? Have you ever had to stand up without raising your voice? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, whether it's a similar story from your life or just what this meant to you. Let's keep this conversation going. And if this story moved you even a little, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.